In 1889, in the declining whaling port of Whitby, Yorkshire, a 10-year-old boy named Thomas Blackwell kept a journal that would disturb anyone who opened it. Inside were 47 pages of anatomical sketches, detailed, precise, clinical. But the subjects were not animals or adult cadavers. They were children, ages 4 to 12, all examined in the cellar laboratory of his father, a respected physician. The drawings showed fractures, lung tissue, measurements taken with a steady hand. At the back of the journal was a coded list, 11 initials, 11 dates, all within 6 months. When a museum curator matched those initials to parish death records in 2019, she found something that should not have been possible. Some of those examination dates came before the official deaths were recorded. This is the story preserved in Thomas Blackwell's own hand, corroborated by workhouse ledgers, burial records, and one unsent letter, written 9 years later. How did a child gain access to 11 fresh cadavers in half a year? And why did no one stop him? We invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time at which you are listening to this documentary. We are interested to know where these documented accounts reach. If this search for truth matters to you, subscribe and stand with us. The leather portfolio arrived at Whitby Museum on a Tuesday morning in March of 2019, part of a larger estate auction lot purchased from the descendants of the Blackwell family. Emma Ashford had been curator of local history collections for 6 years, long enough to recognize the smell of old paper and the weight of something preserved with care. The portfolio was sealed with a brass clasp, the leather cracked but intact, and inside was a single volume bound in marbled boards. The title page, written in a child's careful copper plate hand, read, "Observational Record, T.A. Blackwell, age 10, Anno Domini 1889. Emma opened it, standing at her desk, coffee cooling beside her. The first page showed a pencil sketch of a ribcage, small and delicate, rendered with anatomical precision. The second page showed a hand, fingers extended, each joint labeled in Latin. The third page showed a child's face in profile, eyes closed, mouth slightly open. The sketch was clinical, measured, undisturbed by sentiment. In the margin, an adult's handwriting had added a note. Observe the structure of the orbital bone. Compare to Gray's plate 47. She turned through the pages slowly. 47 sketches in total. All children, ages 4 to 12, judging by the proportions. Some showed internal organs laid open. Others showed skeletal structures, fracture lines marked in red ink. A few included margin notes on tissue density, discoloration, stages of decomposition. The handwriting alternated between the child's careful script and the adult's confident annotations. The tone throughout was one of curiosity, instruction, mutual study. There was no horror in it, no hesitation, just observation. Emma's son was 10 years old. She sat down and pulled the journal closer. The final page was different. It contained no sketches, only a list written in a simple substitution cipher that took her less than an hour to decode. 11 entries, each with a set of initials, a date, and a brief notation. E.M., July 9th, lung tissue, water damaged. J.T., April 2nd, green stick fracture, left radius. A.W., September 23rd, fever, petechial hemorrhaging observed. The dates ranged from March to November of 1889. The notations were matter-of-fact. Whitby, in 1889, had been a town in decline. The whaling industry had collapsed decades earlier. The jet trade, once prosperous, was fading as fashion turned elsewhere. The town survived on herring fishing, a modest railway connection, and the slow beginnings of seaside tourism that would not fully bloom until the next century. It was a place where children worked in factories, in mines, in domestic service, where death was common enough to pass without much investigation, where a respectable physician could maintain a private laboratory in his home, and no one would think to question what went on there. Emma pulled the museum's archived copy of the 1890 census and cross-referenced the address listed in the Blackwell auction catalog. 47 Church Street, a substantial townhouse near St. Mary's Church, 3 stories, with a cellar laboratory noted in the property assessment. Dr. Cornelius Blackwell had been listed as general practitioner and surgical consultant to Whitby Workhouse. His son, Thomas, had been listed as scholar, age 10. His wife, Mary, had not been listed at all. Emma checked the parish records and found her death recorded in October of 1888, cause listed as complications of childbirth. The infant had not survived. Thomas had been 9 years old when his mother died. The journal began 5 months later. Emma returned to the sketches. 3 of them showed identical fracture patterns in the left forearm, greenstick fractures, the kind that occurred in living bone under sudden force, the kind a child might sustain from a fall, or from being grabbed too hard, or from something worse. The dates on those 3 sketches were April 2nd, June 14th, and August 7th. She made a note to check whether the workhouse records had survived the fire of 1923. Tucked into the back of the journal was a yellowed newspaper clipping, folded twice. The Whitby Gazette, November 16th, 1889. The headline read, "Local Physician's Son Honored by Yorkshire Medical Society." The article was brief. Young Thomas Blackwell, aged 10, had been invited to present his anatomical findings to the Society's annual meeting in York. The article praised his uncommon dedication to natural philosophy and predicted he would become a second William Harvey in the making. The attending physicians had reportedly been impressed by the quality of his specimens and the maturity of his observations. Emma looked at the sketch of the child's face again. The closed eyes, the careful measurement marks along the jawline, the marginal note in the father's hand. Note the fontanelle closure, estimate age at 5 to 6 years. She closed the journal and sat in the silence of her office. Outside, school groups were arriving for the morning tour. Children's voices echoed through the corridors. She thought about Thomas Blackwell at 10 years old, standing in a cellar laboratory with his father, learning to measure the bodies of other children. She thought about the 11 initials on that final page. She thought about the fact that someone had preserved this journal for 130 years, sealed it carefully, and included it in a family estate sale as though it were just another artifact of Victorian scientific curiosity. She picked up her phone and called the diocesan archives. She needed to see the parish burial records for St. Mary's Church, March through November, 1889. She needed to know who those initials belonged to. The parish records arrived in a cardboard archive box 3 days later, accompanied by a note from the diocesan archivist explaining that the burial registers for St. Mary's Church had been digitized only partially, and that the 1880s remained in their original bound ledgers. Emma signed for the box and carried it to the museum's climate-controlled research room, where she laid out cotton gloves and a notepad and began the work of cross-referencing initials against dates of death. The ledger was heavy, leather-bound, its pages thick with iron gall ink that had faded to brown in places. The entries were recorded in the hand of the parish sexton, each one listing name, age, date of death, cause, and location of burial. The paupers section burials were marked with a small cross in the margin. Emma worked chronologically, starting with March of 1889. By late afternoon, she had matched 6 of the 11 initials. Eliza Morris, age 7, buried April 11th. Cause of death listed as accidental drowning in the River Esk. James Turnbull, age 6, buried April 5th. Cause listed as consumption. Anne Wycliffe, age 11, buried September 26th. Cause listed as complications of fever. 3 more followed the same pattern. Children between 4 and 11, all buried in the paupers section. all dead of causes common enough in an era when typhus and tuberculosis moved freely through workhouse dormitories and crowded tenement rooms. None of the deaths would have raised questions. Child mortality in Whitby's poorest neighborhoods hovered near 20%. Fever, drowning, wasting illness. These were facts of life. What unsettled Emma was not the causes, but the dates. Thomas Blackwell's journal listed examination dates for several of the children that preceded the recorded deaths by 2 to 6 days. Eliza Morris, for instance, appeared in the journal on July 9th with the notation, lung tissue, water damaged. But the parish register recorded her death as July 11th and her burial as July 13th. The gap was small, but consistent across 3 of the 6 matched names. Emma pulled the partial workhouse records that had survived the fire of 1923. The physician's ledger was incomplete, pages missing or charred at the edges, but it covered portions of 1889. Dr. Cornelius Blackwell's signature appeared on 4 of the 6 death certificates she had matched. This was unremarkable. He had been the attending physician to the workhouse. It would have been his responsibility to sign certificates for unclaimed dead or for residents who died in institutional care. The ledger showed he had made his rounds punctually, 3 times weekly, and had treated the usual array of respiratory infections, fevers, injuries from factory work, malnutrition complications. There were 3 ways to interpret what she was seeing. The first was that Dr. Blackwell had access to the bodies after death through legitimate channels. Under the Anatomy Act of 1832, unclaimed bodies from workhouses could be used for medical education. A provincial physician training his son in anatomy would have been unusual, but not illegal. The second interpretation was that the Blackwells had paid for access to bodies through less formal means. Grave robbing had declined after the Anatomy Act, but it had not vanished entirely, especially in cases where families were too poor to guard burial sites or too transient to notice disturbances. The third interpretation was darker and harder to dismiss. The predated journal entries suggested the possibility that Thomas had examined some of these children while they were still alive, or shortly after deaths that had not yet been officially recorded. Emma contacted a colleague at York University, a historian who specialized in Victorian medical ethics. He confirmed that child apprentices in medicine were not uncommon in the 1880s, particularly in families where the father was a physician. Formal medical education was still consolidating. Many doctors trained their sons at home, starting with animal dissections and progressing to human anatomy if specimens were available. But he also noted that the typical starting age for such training was 14 or older, and that it usually began with observation rather than hands-on documentation. A 10-year-old producing anatomical sketches of this quality would have required not just aptitude, but extensive, repeated access to fresh cadavers. The museum board met on a Thursday. Emma presented her findings in careful, neutral language. She described the journal as a significant artifact of provincial medical education and noted the historical value of understanding how children were involved in scientific study during the Victorian period. One board member, a retired solicitor whose family had donated to the museum for 3 generations, asked whether Emma intended to make the findings public. Another board member, a local historian who had published on Whitby's maritime decline, suggested that imposing modern ethical standards on 1889 was anachronistic. Medical practice had been different then. Death had been different then. To judge Dr. Blackwell by contemporary norms was, he argued, a form of historical ignorance. Emma did not argue. She simply noted that she would continue researching the Blackwell estate materials and cross-referencing them with surviving institutional records. The board authorized limited funding for additional archival consultation. That evening, she returned to the journal and examined it under magnification. One of the sketches included background detail she had missed on first review: a section of brick wall with a distinctive corbel pattern along the top edge. She pulled the estate photographs from the museum's acquisition files. There, in a 1923 image of the Blackwell house taken for a property assessment, was the same wall. It was the cellar laboratory at 47 Church Street. She sat back and looked at the photograph. The cellar had a high window, barred, a workbench, shelves lined with specimen jars, and in the corner, barely visible, a small wooden stool positioned at the height a child might use. Emma brought in Dr. Sarah Chen in early April. Chen was a forensic anthropologist at Newcastle University who specialized in Victorian-era skeletal analysis and had testified in several cold cases involving historical remains. She arrived on a gray morning with a laptop, a scanner, and a methodical approach that Emma found steadying. Chen spent 2 hours examining the journal under magnification, photographing each sketch, taking notes in a shorthand Emma could not decipher. When she finally spoke, her assessment was precise. The green stick fractures visible in 3 of the sketches showed identical characteristics: location at the distal third of the left radius, angle of force consistent with a twisting motion, degree of displacement suggesting the bone had broken under stress but not snapped completely through. Chen pointed to the sketch dated April 2nd. This is a fresh fracture. You can see the attention to the way the periosteum is torn here. Whoever drew this was looking at it within hours of the injury, possibly less. She moved to the next sketch, dated June 14th. Same location, same force vector, same handling. The third sketch, dated August 7th, showed the pattern again. Emma asked what that suggested. Chen did not speculate. She said only that 3 unrelated children sustaining identical fractures in the same 6-month period was statistically improbable, unless there was a common mechanism of injury. She noted that greenstick fractures were associated with children because their bones were more flexible than adult bones, less likely to break cleanly. The fractures could result from falls, from rough handling, from industrial accidents, or from deliberate force applied with knowledge of where a child's arm would give way under pressure. Emma asked whether the sketches showed post-mortem or peri-mortem examination. Chen studied the drawings again and said the level of detail suggested the subjects had been very recently deceased, or, in some cases, potentially still alive. Certain notations in the margins referenced tissue elasticity, color of mucous membranes, degree of rigor. These were observations that degraded quickly after death. She added that it was impossible to know for certain without the remains themselves, but the evidence pointed to examinations conducted within a narrow window of time. Emma returned to the coded list and expanded her search beyond St. Mary's Parish. She contacted archivists in nearby Russwarp, Slights, and Sandsend. 3 more of the initials matched burial records in adjacent parishes. All were children between ages 5 and 9. All had died between March and November of 1889. All had been buried in paupers' sections. One family, listed as domestic servants in a manor house outside Whitby, had left behind a small archive of correspondence, now held by the North Yorkshire Record Office. Emma requested copies. The letters arrived as scanned PDFs. Most were mundane: arrangements for wages, requests for time off, complaints about working conditions. One letter, dated August of 1889 and written by a housemaid named Catherine Dennison, to her sister in Scarborough, mentioned the death of her daughter. Our Mary passed on the 19th. The doctor said it was fever, but she had been well enough the week before. They buried her quick. No viewing, said it was best. When we went to the grave a fortnight later, the ground looked disturbed, like something had been at it. The sexton said it was animals, but I do not think so. Her father wanted to make trouble, but we cannot afford to lose our position. Emma cross-referenced the date. Mary Dennison, age 8, appeared in Thomas Blackwell's journal with the initials MD and the notation pulmonary examination, tissue samples adequate. The examination date in the journal was August 21st. The burial date in the parish register was August 20th. She contacted the Royal Society Archives in London and requested copies of Thomas Blackwell's 1889 lecture to the Yorkshire Medical Society. The documents arrived within a week. The lecture had been titled Observations on Comparative Pediatric Pathology and included 4 hand-drawn plates showing cross-sections of lung tissue at various stages of disease progression. The plates were labeled Specimen A through Specimen D. Emma compared them to the sketches in the journal. The correspondence was exact. Thomas had presented the internal organs of children he had documented in his cellar laboratory to a room of physicians who had praised his work and encouraged his continued study. Emma's son asked her at dinner what she was working on. She told him it was a research project about old medical practices. He asked if it was interesting. She said yes, but it was also sad. He asked why. She found she could not answer in a way that would make sense to a 10-year-old, so she changed the subject and asked about his day at school. That night, she returned to the journal and read through Thomas's earlier volumes, the ones cataloged separately in the estate auction. They dated from 1886 to 1888, covering ages 7 through 9. The early pages showed nature sketches, birds, insects, pressed flowers, small mammals. The handwriting was looser, more childlike. His mother's annotations appeared frequently in the margins, encouraging and gentle. Well observed, Thomas. Compare this to the wren we saw last spring. Your eye for detail improves each season. The sketches were competent, but ordinary, the work of a curious boy with artistic talent. The shift occurred after October of 1888, the month his mother died. The nature sketches stopped. The handwriting tightened. His father's annotations replaced his mother's, and the tone changed from encouragement to instruction. Note the structure of the clavicle. Observe the articulation of the joint. Precision is the foundation of science. By March of 1889, the first human subject appeared. A child's hand, palm up, fingers slightly curled. The notation read, Initial study, specimen provided by father, age estimated 6 years, cause of death recorded as consumption. Emma closed the journal and sat in the silence of her office. She thought about a boy who had lost his mother and found himself alone with a father who taught him that grief could be converted into observation, that death could be made useful, that science required the suppression of feeling. She thought about how a 10-year-old, desperate for connection, might follow his father into a cellar laboratory and learn to see bodies instead of children. She thought about the 11 names on the list and how none of them had been given a choice. Emma found the letter in late April, buried in a miscellaneous folder of estate papers that the auction house had included as part of the Blackwell acquisition. It was a single sheet of heavy stationery, dated March of 1898, written in Thomas Blackwell's adult hand, but never folded, never addressed, never sent. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but the words were still legible. It began without preamble. Father, I cannot continue in medicine. I have tried. I attended lectures at York for 2 terms and found I could not enter the dissection theater without becoming ill. Every cadaver on the table has a face I recognize, though I know this is impossible. Every patient who comes to me for consultation becomes one of them in my mind. You told me it was science. You told me they had already passed and that observation was a service to the living. But I remember the one with the fracture. Her name was Eliza. She cried, Father, I heard her, I know I did. The letter continued for another paragraph, apologizing for disappointing his father's expectations, expressing gratitude for the education he had received, and requesting permission to pursue a different path. It ended without signature. Emma read it 3 times, then set it aside and pulled Thomas Blackwell's obituary from the museum's newspaper archive. He had died in 1934 at age 55. The obituary was brief, noting only that he had been a devoted son, a private scholar, and a supporter of local charities. No mention of medical practice, no mention of family, no mention of achievement. He had lived the last 45 years of his life in the same house where he had kept his journal as a boy, and he had never married, never worked, never left Whitby except for those 2 failed terms at York. Emma contacted Dr. Chen again and asked whether it would be possible to conduct ground-penetrating radar surveys of the paupers' graves at St. Mary's Churchyard. Chen explained the legal complications. Descendants would need to consent, or the church would need to authorize the investigation on grounds of historical significance, or there would need to be probable cause of criminal activity. Emma argued that the letter constituted evidence of coercion and potential harm. Chen agreed to approach the diocese on the condition that any findings would be handled with appropriate forensic protocols, and that the investigation would be framed as a study of Victorian burial practices, rather than an accusation of specific wrongdoing. The diocese granted permission in June. The survey took place over 2 days in early July, using equipment borrowed from a geology department at Durham University. Chen supervised while a team of graduate students mapped the section of St. Mary's Churchyard, where the 6 matched names had been buried. The radar detected anomalies in 2 of the graves, soil compaction patterns inconsistent with undisturbed interment, density variations suggesting the graves had been opened and refilled at some point after the original burial. These findings alone proved nothing. Grave robbing had been common enough in the 1800s, and the disturbances could have been the result of later construction, root systems, or natural soil settling. The 3rd grave showed something different. It belonged to Eliza Morris, age 7, buried July 13, 1889. The radar imaging showed skeletal positioning inconsistent with careful interment. The remains appeared partially displaced, the spine curved at an angle that suggested the body had been laid in the grave, in haste or distress. More troubling was the density pattern around the upper torso and skull, which showed characteristics that Chen described as potentially consistent with respiratory effort after burial. She was careful to qualify this. Ground-penetrating radar could not provide definitive proof of live burial. It could only suggest patterns that warranted further investigation. But the combination of skeletal positioning, soil density, and the timeline in Thomas's journal created a picture that was difficult to dismiss. Emma returned to the journal and found the entry for Eliza Morris. The initials EM appeared on July 9th with the notation: subject sedated per father's instruction. Respiration slow, pulse weak. Excellent conditions for pulmonary examination. Observe the stillness. Minimal interference with measurement. 2 days later, the parish register recorded her death by accidental drowning. Dr. Cornelius Blackwell had signed the death certificate. He had also been the one to report finding her body near the river on the morning of July 11th, during his usual workhouse rounds. Emma cross-referenced Blackwell's workhouse ledger. Eliza Morris had been treated for fever on July 6th. The ledger noted she had been given a tonic and sent home with her family. There was no record of a follow-up visit, no record of her condition worsening, no record of how a child recovering from fever at home ended up drowned in the river 3 days later, discovered by the same physician who had treated her and whose son had examined her body in sufficient detail to sketch her lung tissue and note the presence of water damage. The hypothesis that had seemed possible in March now felt inescapable. Dr. Cornelius Blackwell had used his position as workhouse physician to access vulnerable children. He had used his authority to sign death certificates without scrutiny. He had used his laboratory to involve his grieving, isolated son in examinations that no child should have witnessed, let alone documented. And in at least one case, he may have hastened a death to secure a specimen. Emma sat in the archive room with the letter in front of her and thought about Thomas Blackwell at 19, trying to explain to his father why he could not practice medicine. She thought about him at 55, dying alone in the house where it had all happened. She thought about the journal, preserved and sealed, passed down through the family estate as though it were simply another artifact of Victorian scientific curiosity. And she thought about Eliza Morris, age 7, who had cried in a cellar laboratory while a 10-year-old boy watched, and a respected physician told him it was science. Emma published her findings in the autumn issue of Victorian Studies Quarterly under the title Medical Apprenticeship and Child Agency in Provincial 1880s Yorkshire. The article was careful, constrained, built on documented evidence rather than speculation. She presented the journal as a window into how children were involved in scientific education during a period of minimal regulatory oversight. She discussed the social conditions that made such involvement possible, workhouse mortality rates, the legal ambiguities surrounding anatomical education, the power dynamics between physicians and impoverished families. She noted the evidence suggesting that Dr. Cornelius Blackwell had exploited his institutional access and that his son, Thomas, had been both participant and victim in practices that violated any reasonable standard of medical ethics, Victorian or contemporary. She did not use the word murder. She did not have proof sufficient to make that claim across 130 years. What she had was a pattern of access, opportunity, and outcome that suggested at minimum gross negligence and at maximum something far worse. She centered the children in her analysis. She gave them names where records allowed. She described them as individuals with families, with lives that had been cut short, and then used without consent for the advancement of a physician's reputation and his son's education. The museum opened an exhibit in November titled The Ethics of Victorian Medicine. It included the journal, displayed in a climate-controlled case with interpretive text explaining the context of provincial medical education, the legal framework governing anatomical study, and the institutional failures that had allowed vulnerable children to become specimens. The exhibit also included statistical panels on workhouse mortality, child labor conditions, and the development of medical regulation in the late 19th century. Visitors could see the journal but could not touch it. The sketches were visible but not reproduced in detail. The names of the children were listed on a separate memorial panel, along with their ages and the years they had lived. The Blackwell descendants threatened legal action for defamation. Their solicitor sent a letter arguing that the article and exhibit constituted a malicious attack on the reputation of a respected family, and that Emma had imposed contemporary moral standards on historical practices in a way that was both anachronistic and libelous. The museum's legal counsel responded that the article was based on documented evidence, that it made no claims beyond what the archival record supported, and that public interest in historical medical ethics outweighed any reputational concerns for individuals who had been dead for over 80 years. The descendants withdrew their threat, but requested that the museum add contextual language, emphasizing that Dr. Blackwell had served the poor and that medical ethics in 1889 were fundamentally different from modern standards. The museum declined. In December, Emma received an email from a woman named Claire Hewitt, who had traced her family genealogy and discovered that her great-great-aunt had been Eliza Morris. She had read the article and wanted to know more. Emma met her at a cafe in Whitby on a cold afternoon when rain blew in from the sea. Claire was in her 40s, a teacher, calm and direct in her questions. She said her family had always known that Eliza had drowned young, but had never known the circumstances. She said there had been an oral tradition, passed down through her great-grandmother, that Eliza had been terrified of doctors, that she would scream when Dr. Blackwell came to the house, that her mother had thought it was childish fear, but had felt guilty about it after Eliza died. Emma showed her the journal entry, the sketch, the notation about sedation and stillness. Claire read it without speaking. When she looked up, her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. She said she wanted to know the truth, whatever it was, but she also did not want Eliza reduced to a case study, a footnote in someone else's story about medical ethics and Victorian exploitation. Emma understood. She said that was why she had written the article the way she had, why the exhibit listed names and ages, why she had fought to keep the focus on the children, rather than on the spectacle of what had been done to them. Claire asked whether Emma thought Dr. Blackwell had killed Eliza. Emma said she did not know for certain. She said the evidence suggested he had at minimum hastened her death, that he had sedated her and examined her in conditions that were neither therapeutic nor educational, but exploitative. She said it was possible he had gone further, that the timeline and the journal notation and the circumstances of the drowning all pointed toward something deliberate. But she also said that proving intent across 130 years was impossible, and that what mattered now was acknowledging what had happened and ensuring that Eliza and the others were remembered as children who had deserved better. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, tourists walked past in raincoats, heading toward the Abbey ruins on the hill. Claire said she was glad someone had finally looked. She said her family would appreciate the memorial panel. She said she thought Eliza would have wanted people to know her name. Emma returned to the museum that evening and stood in front of the exhibit. A school group had come through earlier in the day. One of the teachers had left a note in the visitor book. Important to remember that children have always been vulnerable. Important to remember that adults have always had the power to protect or harm. Emma read it twice, then closed the book and turned off the lights. The journal remained in its case, sealed behind glass, the sketches visible to anyone who wanted to see them. The names remained on the memorial panel: Eliza Morris, James Turnbull, Anne Wycliffe, Mary Dennison, and 7 others whose initials had been matched to parish records, whose lives had been brief and hard, and had ended in a cellar laboratory where a grieving boy had learned to measure death and call it science. Emma thought about Thomas Blackwell, who had carried that knowledge for 45 years and had never spoken of it except in one unsent letter. She thought about the journal, preserved with care, passed through generations, finally opened in a museum archive, where someone had the tools and the time to understand what it meant. She wondered if Thomas had known, when he sealed it, that someday it would be found. She wondered if that had been his last act of resistance, his only way of saying what he could not say aloud. This happened. These were children. Someone should know.